Waite, a 1999 graduate of UMBC with a political science degree. So we can refer to him as a graduate of the last century, right, Colonel Waite. And we're delighted to have here students from 3 political science, upper level political science classes, and hopefully some other students as well. But we have POLI 395, U.S. National Security. We have that whole class is here. And then we have some students from POLI 481, Nuclear Weapons in World Politics, and POLI 488, International Relations of South Asia. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Felipe Filomeno, the Associate Director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship, and Amy Barnes, the Program Coordinator for CS3. And I'd like to thank CS3 for their support and thank the Political Science Department, Dr. Carolyn Forestier, our chair, for her support as well. But most of all, thank Colonel Waite for joining us. We had hoped to have him on campus, very much had hoped that, but that went the way of all other hopes for face-to-face contact. So I'm going to turn things over at this point to Dr. Haggerty, okay, to properly introduce Colonel Waite. Let me just say that Colonel Waite will talk for a while about his experiences and touch on some topics that we asked him to touch on related to U.S. nuclear strategy. And then we will open it for some Q&A, and we have a four-student panel here this evening who will receive questions from the POLI 395 class and reflect some of those questions forward to Colonel Waite. Okay, Dr. Haggerty.
Thank you very much, Bridget. We are delighted to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Waite back to campus, a UMBC grad, as Bridget mentioned. He is the son of an Army officer who grew up all over the United States and elsewhere in Europe, like a lot of so-called military brats. He came to UMBC and while he was here, linked up with the Johns Hopkins Army ROTC program in 1999. And ever since, he has had one of those careers where, at least when I look at it, I think that the U.S. military might be one of the best lifelong learning institutions in the world. It's incredible the different types of jobs one can do, the different functions one learns, and the just higher education experience that never stops. It's really, really impressive. The bio I'm about to talk from is really about a third to a quarter of his real bio, so we might be able to distribute that. But he has worked extensively as an explosive ordnance disposal officer and held positions in nuclear weapons fields related to disablement and targeting and counter-proliferation and consequence management going back to 2006. His many assignments have included various bases across the continental US, Korea, Germany, Hawaii, and he's also had 3 combat deployments, Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan in 2010-11 and 2013. He also supported efforts for the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons stockpile in early 2014, and then later on in 2014 deployed to West Africa in support of U.S. efforts to halt the outbreak of the Ebola virus. Lieutenant Colonel Waite has a master's degree in international relations and national security policy from Troy University, and he is currently a resident student at the U.S. Army War College at Carlisle Barracks, not far away in southern Pennsylvania. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Waite and thank him in advance for joining us. It's a real privilege.
No, well, thank you very much for that great introduction. First off, I'd just like to thank the academic staff, specifically Professor Starkey, for the opportunity to speak. So this is actually a requirement for the U.S. Army War College, is to address a public audience that is non-military. So this is fulfilling my own graduation requirement, so I appreciate it. But if we just want to throw the slides up here, you know, it's not really an Army briefing if it's not death by PowerPoint. So I assure you, I think I have a total of 10 slides, and I'll try to push through them relatively rapidly so we can get to the questions, because it's always my favorite part of any briefing. So next slide, please. So they require you in the military to always have an outline or agenda. So briefly, this is what we're going to talk about today. The most important takeaway is the item down there in the red box. It's what I call my get out of jail free card. Prevents me from being cited by military regulations and showing up in a court martial, because any information and view that I express today is my own, and I do not reflect the official stance of the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. I will also try to avoid at all costs discussing any classified information, so this briefing is going to be in a fully unclassified, but we will talk about some interesting topics that you may not have heard about yet. So next slide, please. All right, so the bottom line is about 22 years ago, I was sitting in the exact same seat that you are. Well, you know, obviously I was on campus. We didn't have COVID quite yet. But I was getting ready to embark on a world of a military career, but spending most of my time worried about just passing my next exam. I'm pretty sure that if Dr. Hody is online right now, she will tell you I probably still owe her at least one paper, if not two. So someday I will knock all those out and fully graduate. So I was an Army brat. As mentioned in my bio, I've had 31 homes in 44 years. So those homes have spanned Asia, Europe, everywhere in the United States. Some lasted less than 6 months, and one, specifically my time at UMBC, was 4 years long, which is by far and away the longest that I've ever lived in one location in my life. I did choose UMBC because I did attend Aberdeen High School up there in Aberdeen, Maryland, and then my father was stationed at the Pentagon, but he lived in Maryland, so I was able to get in-state tuition, which is always important as the son of an Army officer. You can't afford to go to, you know, Princeton or things like that, so you make do with what you got. But I had an outstanding educational experience at UMBC. You know, some of my best friends in the world are still folks that I went to class with, and I met my first wife there at UMBC. So entered college when my father was at the Pentagon. I do have a master's degree. I'm a lieutenant colonel. I've got 21 years in as of last January. And I did spend some time over in Iraq and Afghanistan. We'll get to that. I am a nuclear target analyst in addition to being an explosive ordnance disposal officer. So not only can I take apart nuclear weapons when I have to, which is super exciting, I assure you, I also have the capability to run plots to identify specific weapons, burst altitudes, burst types to achieve specific effects on targets, as well as analyzing potential consequences such as fallout, zones and other things to safeguard both civilian populations to the best of our ability, but also to safeguard our military forces that will be moving into the area. I have spent active time on the counter-proliferation front while at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and I was part of a special team operating with special forces for the reduction of various weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear for several years, operating out of Europe with a focus on Africa and the Middle East. And as they said, I'm currently a War College student right up the road from you in Carlisle. So I had really hoped to be able to drive down to UMBC and walk around and see if I could still make it all the way from Potomac up to the academic buildings, or if I've gotten too old, but I will have to wait for another chance. Next slide, please. So they did ask me to talk a little bit about my military experiences to give you kind of a frame of reference. I did join up in January of 2000. It was a nation at peace at the time, largely. I graduated from the Infantry Officer Basic Course and was assigned to Korea. I was working on the DMZ, doing great for about just over 18 months. And then wonder of all wonders, September 11th happened. So it's actually September 11th for me was 10 o'clock at night. I was awoken by our staff duty NCO to let me know that the United States was under attack. I turned on the TV just in time to see the second plane hit the tower and hear the reports about the planes going into the Pentagon. I spent the next hour and a half throwing ammunition and equipment into the back of trucks with my soldiers and preparing to move north to the DMZ because we weren't really sure what the span of that attack was. When I wasn't doing that, I was frantically trying to get a cell phone call out to determine whether or not my father had lived. Found out later that he did lose some friends that day, but thankfully he made it. 2 years after that, I was involved in the invasion of Iraq. I joined explosive ordnance disposal in 2005, so I decided that infantry wasn't exciting enough, and to mainly anger my mother, I joined a job where I got to cut wires on bombs for a living. She is super thrilled to this day. That opportunity, though, has allowed me to do a bunch of interesting things. I have worked security detail for Presidents Bush and Presidents Obama. I've spent quality time, or quote-unquote quality time, in Crawford, Texas, at President Bush's ranch, which is truly in the middle of nowhere. I have 2 tours in Afghanistan. Those are my most recent combat tours. I did assist in the development and the deployment of the Cape Ray vessel and the denaturation system that we used on that ship, because for those of you who don't know, you cannot transport chemical weapons across state lines. The Europeans get very edgy when you try to evacuate them out of Syria and then bring them into Europe for disposal. So we actually have to develop a system on a boat out in the middle of the Mediterranean where we could strip those various chemical weapons, to include sarin, down to other compounds that would not be treaty violations, at which point we could transload them to countries on the northern edge of the Mediterranean where they could just go into normal hazmat disposal and be disposed of. So pretty proud of that operation. We did reduce their stockpile. They ended up making a few extra rounds later on through various labs that were not declared, but we did destroy literally hundreds of tons of chemical weapons. I did pretty well on that job, and sometimes, in the military, success breeds more pain. So I did get the opportunity to deploy out to West Africa to support the nation of Ghana. Specifically, I was assigned as an advisor to the Deputy Secretary of Health, Dr. Victor Bampo, to support the development of emergency operation centers to fight Ebola as the outbreak was occurring. Finally got out of that job, spent some time bopping around the world, ended up out in Hawaii, which is probably one of my favorite assignments, where I was a battalion commander for 300 soldiers that ran all explosive ordnance disposal and chemical operations in the Pacific, and then got selected out of that to come to the War College. So I've got about 9 years left. My mother is still counting the days till I retire, and that should be around sometime in 2030. I'm going to live out in the Seattle area where I've already bought a house. So the photos that you see, obviously the one on the upper left, everyone recognizes. The photo to the right of that is a convoy in Iraq in early 2003 during one of their fantabulous dust storms. The photo next on the left in the middle is a photo of a traffic jam in Afghanistan with a local herder pushing sheep through as I prepared to move a convoy through. Photo on the right is the 85-pound bomb suit that I have the opportunity to wear. Rest assured, it is very slimming. That's me working on a landmine. Bottom left is a photo of exiting a C-17 while it's in flight. It's, join the Army and get the opportunity to jump out of a quote-unquote perfectly good airplane. I will state that the planes are monitored by the Air Force, and that one was heavily leaking when I got off of it, so I was very excited to be leaving. And the photo on the right is an example of some of the unique things that you get to do in the United States Army. That is me about to eat a live scorpion in Thailand during jungle survival training. That was not on a bet. That was actually a requirement for the course. I will tell you the trick to eating scorpions is to hold them by the tail, take off the stinger first, and then bite down quickly before their claws get the chance to grab back at you, because they really don't take to being eaten. So next slide, please. So why am I talking to you today? Like I said before, I want to graduate too, so I've got to do it. But I did want to, was given the opportunity to pick any school I wanted. I did want to talk to UMBC because I wanted to talk to some that were in my spot years ago. Nuclear strategy is pretty complex. There's a lot of nuances that go into it, and the news cycle that we have today doesn't allow those longer stories really to be written, or they are written mainly from a policy perspective, or from a weapons perspective, or from a cost perspective. So I'm going to try to mix all those three together and paint a more holistic picture for you a little bit. So the information is often confusing, incomplete, or inaccurate. Inaccurate is always the frustrating ones, because you can never tell, are they being inaccurate because they think they're protecting secrets, or are they being inaccurate because they actually don't know anything? It's often, in my experience, been the latter. So, and finally, my research project while I was here at the War College was on the military-civilian divide, specifically how hyperpartisanship within our political class is negatively affecting both the civilian population and the military. But as it comes out, with 1% or less of U.S. citizens serving in the military, and as we've geographically locked in a lot of our bases into the South or into a few states in the West, there's a whole generation or two generations really now that have never met somebody in uniform, have never had the opportunity to ask questions. So this is your opportunity. No question is off limits. Ask away. And I look forward to having a discussion because I am concerned by the fact that I'm a son of a military officer. Most of my peers are the children of military officers, in some cases second and third generation. We seem to be growing our own little social caste system within the United States, and I don't think that's healthy. I really think that the military, we are your military. We should be a reflection of society writ large and not become a warrior class unto our own. Historically, anytime you had that, it did not work out well for those societies. Every time that you made a giant separation between the military and the people. So I'm much more excited about, getting some information out there and answering any of the questions you have. Next slide, please. So now that I've gotten out the requirements to talk about me, we're going to talk about fun stuff, nuclear weapons. All right, so the picture on the right is really how a great meme I saw once, but it perfectly sums up, the concept of nuclear weapons. It's something that constantly barks, and you're pretty sure that it's doing your job, but you can never really prove it. Just because you haven't had a full-scale nuclear exchange between state powers doesn't mean that you were going to if you didn't have massive overmatch. But it's one of the justifications often used to justify budgets. And budgets are important to you because right now, your generation especially is staring down the line of what could end up to be, on the low end, a $1 to $2 trillion nuclear modernization program. Now, some of these modernizations are required. Physically, the equipment is wearing out. It's becoming unsafe as far as stability. So, there will have to be some upgrades made. A lot of it having to do with platforms, really, not necessarily. The warheads are pretty stable. It's the platforms that carry them. The Minuteman III missiles that are ending the end of their lifespan, the Ohio-class submarines. There's only so many times that you can submerge and surface a submarine before metal fatigue within the hull will actually start it to break. So you can't just use those submarines forever. So you do want to replace certain systems, but the question is, do we need to replace at the level that we have now? Can a smaller nuclear arsenal or a smarter nuclear arsenal fit our requirements and come in at a lower cost? I will never be one that says absolutely more nukes. I think we've got plenty of nukes. My personal opinion is that we could probably shave off a fair amount and still maintain that overmatched deterrence that we need. So I'm just going to discuss very, very briefly so everybody has an understanding of what the triad is. So obviously it's ground-based, sea-based, and air-based. The ground-based is currently the Minuteman III missile, which, let's see, I have the numbers here. So we've got about 450 total operational Minuteman missiles. They're spread about through Wyoming, North Dakota, and Montana. There's about 150 missiles per missile field in those three missile fields. Each Minuteman III can carry up to 3 warheads. That is what they are physically capable of carrying, but due to treaty requirements, they are currently only have 1 warhead each. So you ended up having 450 warheads for your 450 missiles. Now, the treaty does not require that you modify the bus, is what it's called essentially, where the warheads are stacked. So because those did not have to be modified, we do have additional warheads in the inventory that we could rapidly mount to those systems if, for example, we withdrew from a treaty or the strategic requirements changed, or if you wanted to decrease the physical number of missiles that you had but maintain the same warhead capability. All right. So submarine forces, you're looking at the Ohio class. We're beginning our transition into the Columbia class right now. So the Ohio class carries the D5 Trident, which has the capability to carry up to 12 warheads, but currently each missile is only carrying 8, again for treaty reasons. Each warhead ranges from the 100 to 475 kilotons, depending on A, the warhead type, or B, whether it's a select-a-yield weapon or a weapon that you can actually designate by the manner in which it detonates to get a larger yield. Each sub carries 20 missiles, 160 warheads per ship. And as of 2010, which is the last unclassified numbers I can provide you with, there were 9 subs based in the Pacific and 5 subs based in the Atlantic. So the basing locations for the Atlantic is actually in Kings Bay in Georgia, because when you think nuclear weapons, Georgia should leap to mind. And the other set is in Bangor, Washington, just outside Seattle. Strangely enough, as I was discussing before class, only about 4 miles from where I bought my retirement house. Clearly shows I do not have a good head for real estate. So aircraft is the final leg of the triad. So most people think in regards to bombers. So your B-52 and your B-2 Spirit, your stealth bomber, are currently your large-scale bombers. The B-1B does have a nuclear capability, and the B-21, which is the newest version of the stealth bomber that's going to become active in about 3 years, also can carry it. And then we have a select number of small fighter aircraft that do have the capability to carry nuclear payloads, specifically gravity bombs. Your larger bombers can carry both gravity bombs as well as air-launched cruise missiles, which provide them greater standoff. Now, standoff's important because as countries are developing more advanced and cheaper air defense missiles, standoff is critical. We can no longer, in the old days of the Soviet Union, we had the expectation that our B-52s would fly over the North Pole and they could penetrate deep into Soviet territory and drop their payloads. I assure you, if a B-52 tried to fly into Russia right now, it would not do very well. Its lifespan would be measured in minutes, if not seconds. So they do have to have a standoff. Now, the air-launched cruise missile, which is basically a Tomahawk cruise missile variant, is currently, there's a new missile under review, and we're going to wait to see I think it went through its second test phase about 3 months ago. So they're looking at fielding a new missile, which basically increased the range and increased its capability to penetrate, extensive air defense networks. So next, so let's talk about deterrence. So all those nuclear missiles I have, your 450 missiles here, your 20 missiles per submarine here, your thousands of gravity bombs and cruise missiles. Are we effectively deterring our threats? And I'll tell you that we are in regards to our peer adversaries. Clearly, our ability to overmatch Russia and China is present. There is a lot of debate within the building as to whether or not you can effectively deter what are called rogue regimes. When I say rogue regimes, immediately things leap to mind like North Korea or Iran. My argument would be that just because they are rogue regimes does not mean that they are irrational regimes. Just because they act differently than us does not mean that they don't consciously consider the manner in which they are going to provide defense of their own nation. So I do believe that you can effectively deter them. A concern when it comes into deterrence is your non-state actors, your terrorist groups. I will tell you that I go to sleep every night very soundly, knowing that the likelihood of a terrorist group developing a nuclear weapon and fielding a nuclear weapon into the United States is exceptionally low. I think I'll be struck by lightning 3 times before I ever have a terrorist nuke inside the United States. I am very concerned about radiological weapons, or the ability to take a conventional explosive, strap it to a cesium-123 or some other type of nuclear source, and detonate that inside of a major urban center. Not because it will kill a ton of people, but it will kill that city effectively. So the areas that would be dusted by the fallout from that type of weapon system and contaminated, in our culture today and our lack of trust in government, I just don't know if you could ever convince people that you had decontaminated that area enough for it to be safe to go back in. So a very small device could effectively render downtown New York, downtown San Francisco, LA, Seattle, unlivable, not because of the actual safety ramifications of the radiological material that may remain, but just because people wouldn't believe it and they wouldn't be willing to live there. And that can very effectively damage economies. So that worries me much more on the non-state actor than any, actual yielding nuclear weapon. So escalation dominance, I'm going to talk about a little bit in my next slide, but it has to do with the escalation ladder, i.e. in every single confrontation between two actors in the international role, there's the expectation that, okay, you do A to me, I'm going to do B to you, you're going to threaten to do C to me, which means I'm going to threaten to do D to you, and you can walk up that escalation ladder. That works very well when you have a long history of interaction between those two actors, let's say the United States and Russia. It does not work as well when you do not have that long-term developed relationship between two other actors, let's say us and Iran, because there is always the potential for signals to be misunderstood and for escalation steps to be jumped and eventually lead to an outcome that nobody wants, but they kind of painted themselves into a corner. So nuclear weapons, you know, they do provide that ultimate escalation dominance, but they also raise the risks when operating with actors that you don't have a good history with understanding their intent or their signals. You know, a signal put out by the Iranian leader that makes complete sense to the Iranian leader based on their culture of, oh, the Americans are clearly going to understand this signal when we send it. We may not understand this signal. It's not because the Iranian actor is irrational. They're just communicating in a system of languages that we don't understand culturally, and you run that risk. And finally, when you talk about modernization, you get into opportunity costs. So, you know, $2 trillion is a lot of money. Even in the military, $2 trillion is a lot of money. So what is that costing us? You know, within the military, it costs you modernization on other programs. It costs you force structure. It costs you, you know, the ability to look at other threats that are not a global thermonuclear war. But bigger than that, as we look at the national debt and how it's ballooning, and we look at, you know, there's an extreme likelihood, I think, in the near term, maybe next year, certainly within 5 to 10 years, where the U.S. military is going to have to take a budget cut, or there's going to have to be a significant tax revenue increase. And we have to look at, are we really spending our money in the right places? You know, and this is me personally. Do not tell the military I said this, because I will be thrown out as a heretic. I'm a big believer in the United States power is never necessarily based on its military capability. The military is the tool that we use because it seems to be easy, and it has become, unfortunately, the tool of first resort as opposed to last resort over about the last 30 years for most problems. But the US's capability has always been its information and desire of people to be free, like us across the world, and the power of our economy. And the way that you have a powerful economy that allows you, A, to fund a military, but B, to move it where it's got to go, to develop new systems for it, to man it, that's based on education and infrastructure. And I would far rather see more money spent on education and infrastructure within the United States and developing our economy to the point that we truly can, once again, project power. You know, the Chinese have already passed us in purchasing power parity. They have not, you know, net exceeded our economy yet, but when you factor in a few economic formulas, basically they've already surpassed us, and there's nothing but growth for them on the horizon. So just having the biggest bat in the closet is not necessarily going to help us. You know, we have to actually get after our economic and our educational requirements as well. So that's when I talk about opportunity costs. Next slide, please. So one of the things that often comes up is strategic versus tactical nuclear weapons. And the reason that this is important is specifically when you deal with the United States versus Russia, essentially. There are some smaller concerns on the Chinese side. And of course, North Korea has just announced that it's developing small scale tactical nuclear weapons for use on the battlefield. But when we talk about strategic versus tactical, we're really talking about the lack of parity between the United States and Russia, especially when it comes to the escalation ladder. So the difference between strategic and tactical nuclear weapons is, first off, the size of the detonation. You know, you have your smaller weapons, you have your what you call your crowd pleasers, you know, your city killers. The intent of use, you know, whether or not you're using it to attack a population center or an industrial center versus you are intending to attack discrete military targets, usually on a battlefield. You can get into tactical nuclear weapons against some command and control bunkers, but normally when we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, we're talking about the Russians have 3 armored divisions moving west. We don't have a capability to defeat them in a conventional sense, so bam, tactical nuclear weapon, we've just killed 3 divisions. The range of the weapon, the type of platform comes into calculus. Most of our tactical weapons, all of our tactical weapons right now in the United States are based off of air platforms. We do not have any missile or any ground-based missile or sea-based platforms right now. We used to, but we did get rid of those as part of the START treaty reductions. The Russians did not do that. All right, so the Russians did take a lot of their weapons away, but they kept a rather robust capability in the tactical side. And this comes dangerously into Russian calculus. And it comes into the fact that the Russians may be betting that in the event of a conflict between the United States and Russia, the Russians could use a tactical nuclear weapon because our only option would then to be respond with a strategic nuclear weapon, the only ones we own. And the Russians, there is some indications that the Russians have gone down this thought process where they have basically said, we think we can get away with this limited use of tactical nuclear weapons. The Americans will not respond because the Americans would have to respond with a strategic weapon, which they then know we would have to respond with additional strategic weapons, and we'd be rapidly climbing that ladder toward, end of the world type criteria. So to try to define for you, because a lot of people don't really understand the power of a nuclear weapon, I had some, free 10 minutes this morning. So I knocked out a quick plot of a nuclear weapons detonation of 475 kilotons, which is kind of on the north end of some of our missile systems. I detonated it directly over the UMBC library in an airburst configuration, because I don't want to dirty up everything. So to give you guys a frame of reference, everything is dead and every single structure is destroyed for 1.8 kilometers out from the burst site. So if you know where the library is and you know where the Giant is over on Wilkins Avenue, which I spent copious amounts of time shopping in as a student, all that's gone. And there's probably about another 0.8 kilometers past that that it's gone. For 2.8 kilometers, which gets you out to the Canton Avenue exit on I-95 toward Baltimore, all your reinforced concrete structures are gone. The only thing that survives is maybe if you had a bunker-style military structure that was heavily hardened. 4.4 kilometers out to the southwest edge of Baltimore, most buildings collapse. Everybody is injured, and fatalities are widespread. 6 kilometers, which gets you to Raven Stadium, you've got residential structures are collapsing. The stadium is probably not going to do too well, just based on the way the structure is constructed and susceptible to wind. Serious injuries are common, and there's probably going to be some fatalities. For 12.7 kilometers, which gets you out well past the eastern edge of Baltimore, you've broken every single window in every single building, and you're going to have injuries from flying glass and some other things. So that gives you an idea of strategic nuclear weapon. All right. Now, your lower end 100 kilotons, cut those numbers in half. All right. If you're on UMBC, you're still not doing too well. You will glow in the dark and you're probably not surviving. All right. But you will see fewer effects on the eastern end of Baltimore. But on the plus side, based on prevailing wind patterns, all your fallout's going right into Baltimore anyway. So the aquarium, still not doing well. So that gives you kind of an idea when we're talking strategic. When you start talking tactical weapons, your detonation ranges really are measured in single kilometers or, football field, size areas. So still large, still impressive, but are not going to have the city killing effects that a strategic would. But like I said, this all comes back into, is the United States capable, currently not really, of responding to the Russian use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Europe? All right, so that's one of the conversations they're having. So when you hear terms such as nuclear modernization or development of quote unquote new weapons, in many cases, we're just bringing weapons out of the stockpile that we already have and we're reconfiguring them into a different platform that allows us to employ them. So you're not building up additional warheads, you're changing the configuration of some warheads into a platform that you could actually utilize it. And mainly we're doing that, and the reason we're announcing it publicly is because we're hoping to influence Russia's thought process on their utilization of tactical nuclear weapons. Because our bottom line is we don't want anyone using nuclear weapons, but the only way that we can ensure it is that we have the ability to respond in kind and therefore try to refocus their thinking a little bit. So next slide, please. So now to the scary stuff. All right, so nuclear states developing concerns, or what I like to call you never want to sleep soundly again. All right, so as you look at increased proliferation, obviously the AQCon network really helped us out on that. Spread nuclear weapons technology and infrastructure across many states, some of which you have heard of, some of which you have not. We do have more states with nuclear weapons than we did during the Cold War, significantly. Those states are increasing the size of their arsenals in many cases, and they're increasing the types, not just the number. So does mutually assured destruction still apply? And these are questions, that I open to the class of, yes, mutually assured destruction still works absolutely between us and Russia. Still works with us against China. Does it affect us when it comes to Iran? North Korea? If the Kim regime thought it was about to fall, would the last death stroke of it be to launch? So these are things that we're worried about, because right now he has demonstrated that he has at least the missile capacity to reach most of the continental United States. There's still some open questions about whether or not he has a warhead that will survive re-entry and still be effective. But he's getting, if he's not there already, he's getting close. So the lack of clear escalation steps, this really comes into not a nuclear exchange between us and someone else. This comes into nuclear weapons exchanges between two other nuclear armed states that are not us, i.e. the one that really keeps me up at night is Pakistan and India. When you look at the history of animosity between the two nations, the number of conflicts they've fought, the number of times they fired each other across the Kashmiri border, the incredible economic stress that their populations are under, especially as climate change starts looking at drying out both those countries, as the glaciers that are in the Himalayas, melt away, which is the major source of water in those two countries. Can you imagine these incredibly populous nations that are armed with nuclear weapons that suddenly are running low on water? And because they're relatively new nuclear states, they have not yet had the time, like we developed escalation steps really from 1945 onward. For 7 decades, we've really been developing this. The new entrants just haven't had that learning curve yet, and they're having to learn much faster in a much less stable environment than we were able to learn in. All right. Decreasing safety checks. This really comes into several nations. U.S. nuclear weapons are exceptionally safe. It is very difficult to make them go off, even when you want them to go off. It is virtually impossible to make them go off when it's not intended for them to detonate. We've had tons of accidents over the years. We've had planes fall out of the sky with nuclear weapons on board. We've had bombs ejected out of nuclear weapons. We've had a missile that went off in Damascus, Arkansas, while they were doing maintenance on it, when they dropped a wrench and it penetrated the side of the missile, and the caustic fuel inside reacted and caused that missile to go propulsive. Super exciting for everyone on the repair crew, I assure you. That warhead was found, less than a quarter mile from the hole in the ground where the missile used to be. And some EOD guys like me went out and, did what we had to do and picked it up and threw it in the back of the truck and drove off, because that's our job. But they're extremely safe. The physical design characteristics and engineering that we know of for multiple other states, especially the new entrants into the nuclear sphere, are not that robust. And there is significant concern that in an accident situation, one of those weapons could yield a nuclear detonation. And then it comes into, would that country know that it was one of their weapons that just detonated, or would they suspect their neighbor of conducting a nuclear attack against their nuclear weapons storage facility? You can see very rapidly how these lack of escalation steps can lead to a full-on nuclear exchange between those two countries. You also have issues with command and control. So while the United States and the Soviet Union have relatively robust command and control networks to prevent the launch of a nuclear weapon inadvertently, there was a rather scary situation in Russia several years ago where we almost had World War III by accident. For anybody who's ever seen, the movie War Games from the 1980s, just instead of the U.S., it was Russia. And it was basically a lieutenant colonel that stopped World War III because he realized that what the computer was telling him just made no sense. So he did not do what he was supposed to do, which was turn the key. He did the right thing and did not launch all the missiles, but that was how close we came. We also came extremely close during Cuba because the United States did not understand that there were already active weapons on the ground in Cuba. They also did not understand that due to lack of clarity in the orders process, the Russian command on Cuba felt that it had the authorization to launch a unilateral nuclear strike against invading U.S. forces, which came as a very giant shock to the Soviet leadership later on after the crisis was over when they figured this out as to how close. That led to some changes in how they control their nuclear weapons launch authority. But several nations don't have that right now. Several nations, because of the hair trigger nature of the conflicts that they're in, have released nuclear launch authority below levels that I would say the U.S. would be comfortable with. So finally, as we get into this, nuclear weapons are expensive to make, relatively easy to make, but they're expensive to make, they're expensive to maintain. And a lot of countries who don't want to have nuclear weapons dominance or parity with the United States have figured out that they don't need to because they can go through cyber. It's a lot easier to knock out a power grid with cyber or to disrupt other, key infrastructure with cyber in a manner that doesn't require, A, you may have deniability that it was you that did it. B, you haven't really caused any permanent damage, theoretically, so that you don't expect to have a massive nuclear counterstrike against your country. But we are starting to see far more nations get into the cyber realm kind of as a counterpoint because it allows them to reach out and touch the United States or touch some of our allies without having a military that is capable of deploying forward to do that. All right, so cyber, it's getting very interesting out there. There's a reason the military came up with Cyber Command. I know all the news is on, Space Command and their cool uniform, and I think their new names, Guardians, which, trust me, everyone in the Army is mocking them for, as the Guardians of the Galaxy. We enjoyed that, opportunity to beat on the Air Force again. But cyber is going to be a big deal. Rest assured that the current security of our nuclear weapons, the systems are thankfully so antiquated that you can't really hack them because, it's all run on 1960s and 70s technology. So I don't think you could find a hacker that actually speaks the language that most of those systems run on right now. But as we do the upgrades, that's something that we'll really have to look into, is the cyber security of the nuclear weapon systems themselves, as well as the command and control networks that control launch authority. And when you start talking about, the how do we solve the nuclear problem in the future, you see a lot of stuff in the news about, missile defense and the United States military is going to have this magic nuclear umbrella, and it's, a throwback to the Reagan era Star Wars programs. I will tell you that the United States is never, take this one to the bank, is never going to deploy a missile defense system that is sufficiently robust to counter a peer adversary like Russia. All right, Russia has so many missiles, we just couldn't afford to build enough interceptors. So missile defense in the United States is really based on those rogue actors, those one-offs, those countries that could maybe launch 10 missiles, maybe 20. Russia has the capability to launch more than 1,000. So we're not going to counter them. But next slide, please. When you get into, missile defense, and trust me, this is my last slide before we go to questions, missile defense gets complex too. All right, so missile defense is often called, hitting a bullet with a bullet, and that's what it used to be. Two objects moving at faster than the speed of the sound, well faster than bullets actually, striking each other in a known space and time. Now that was relatively easy when those were ballistic missiles, which by definition follow a single ballistic arc. They do not steer. Once they are launched, they are kind of in an arc system, and once they have engine cutoff, they're coming in at a known trajectory. So it's relatively easy to intercept them once you have the radar systems that can see them, and you have an interceptor capable of reaching them at speed. You did have the capability, and our missile systems now do have decoys on them that will confuse interceptors that launch while the missiles are in flight to help muddy up the radar signatures and make it more difficult for a peer-level adversary to counter us. But now folks are getting into what are called hypersonics, that you may have seen in the news, or hypersonic missiles, steerable glide platforms, they're sometimes called. And these are systems that are much more problematic to intercept. A, because they're moving extremely fast, But B, as a ballistic missile is launched, I can predict roughly where it is going to be 20 minutes from now in a specific space and time. So I can launch one of my counter interceptors into that box, as we call it, to intercept it. But now I have to launch missiles not knowing where that glide vehicle is actually going to end up, which makes it far more expensive and far more difficult, if not impossible, for me to intercept those. All right, so that's where it comes at. Can you see it? Yes. Can you hit it? Yeah, if you're in the same time and space, you can. But what if it can dodge? And that becomes very problematic. And then there's the question of, does this increase or decrease, deterrence? There's a reason that we're rapidly trying to field our own hypersonic vehicles, because there's a couple of countries that honestly are probably a little bit ahead of us in this, that we do not like being behind on. All right, so that is escalating a certain level of tension and expense. And then it comes down to, like I said before, is missile defense and hypersonics, are they good for rogue states? Are they good for peers? Or are they good for both? They are not good for peers, just based on the cost and the capability. They can be good enough for rogues at this time. As hypersonic vehicles become more prevalent and cheaper, you could start seeing rogue nations with the capability. There's already been an announcement by North Korea that they're developing their own hypersonic. And that would add significant challenges to our current interception capabilities. So, but with that, we should move on to the next slide, and I'll open to any and all questions.
Thank you very much. That exceeded my greatest expectations. In fact, you better block my phone number, because I'm going to be calling you every time I teach this course now to deliver that lecture. Fabulous. All right, we've got our 4 panelists, Alex, Esanam, John, and Viviana, all set with some questions that I see questions pouring in. So we'll just do as many as we can. So Alex, I would ask you to go ahead and pose a question. And while you're posing it, I'll put it in the Q&A so everybody can see it.
Thank you. So our first question is, would a nuclear-armed Iran catalyze the spread of nuclear weapons throughout the Middle East, especially among non-state actors? Would it have the potential to weaken the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
So short answer is yes. And that's one of the main concerns that we have about Iran developing a nuclear weapon. While Iran's capability to develop a nuclear weapon would challenge us in regards, as you know, we have never really attacked another country that had nuclear weapons in our history. So it would certainly complicate any decision to intervene in Iran for any reason. But one of the major concerns that we have is that the creation of a nuclear weapon within Iran would immediately spur other actors in the region. Saudi Arabia leaps to mind, a few others leap to mind, that would start a Middle East or regional arms race that could rapidly get out of control. If you look back at the number of weapons that the United States developed during the Cold War, and you look back at now, it's comical. Really, the sheer number of nuclear weapons by types that we had. I mean, we literally had what people refer to as the nuclear hand grenade, which was a recoilless rifle round that the detonation was so large that you actually had to lob it over a hill. You couldn't, just fire it direct sight toward your enemy. So we don't want other countries to have to learn those lessons the hard way. So for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, I think without question, would increase the risk of proliferation throughout the region. I do not see it as a direct threat against the United States homeland, at least in the initial stages, because like I said, we have relatively robust missile defense that could counter, at least in the near term, any number of missiles that Iran could develop. And Iran also knows they're rational actors, so the reason they're looking at a nuclear weapon program is because they are rational actors, because they know that the United States have never gone to war with a country that has nuclear weapons, whereas we had a great history of intervening in Iran prior to that. So everyone's like, I can't believe the Iranians want a nuclear weapon. They must be crazy. Like, no, from their perspective, that is a 1,000% rational act. So I hope that answered your question.
Sanam, I'm going to interrupt for 1 minute because Viviana has told me that she has a follow-up question. to this. Okay, so go ahead, Viviana, and then we'll switch over to Esnam.
So, in your opinion, why hasn't Israel's possession of nuclear weapons brought the same kind of nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East that Iran obtaining nuclear weapons would?
No, it's a great question. It's a valid question. So in my point of view, the reason it hasn't is, Israel has never declared that it has nuclear weapons. I will tell you, I'm quite confident they do. I could probably tell you a rough order of magnitude on the number that they have and what platforms they may be using. But a lot of the countries in the Middle East don't see Israel as an expansionist power. All right. They see them kind of as, yes, you're here, you're quote unquote an interloper, or you're occupying territory that you shouldn't be occupying, but they're not afraid necessarily of Israel moving east, and conquering Saudi Arabia or taking into Jordan or going north into Syria or, southwest into Egypt. So there hasn't been that enormous concern. And I think there's also been an understanding with all the Middle Eastern states that the United States' influence over Israel has assured that Israel would not escalate to a nuclear conflict unless it absolutely had to. And most of the Middle Eastern nations see that. That is not the same for Iran. We have many countries in the Middle East that are exceptionally concerned about Iranian influence spreading, and also Iran's desire to expand its territory, not necessarily of its own borders, but through proxy states. So that, I think, is why there be major concerns. I will tell you that I have a Saudi Arabian officer in my class with me. He is quite frank and open that it is his belief that if the Iranians developed a nuclear weapon, that it would be months later that Saudi Arabia would have a crash weapons program, as would several other nations. They are terrified of Iran developing a nuclear weapon. And when you talk to them about Israel, they just kind of wave it off. They're like, yes, they have nuclear weapons, but we will not attack them and they will not attack us, so we don't really care. Whereas Saudi Arabia has recently been attacked by Iran, so that they're more concerned about it. But great question.
Okay, thanks, Viviana. Esanam, let's go to your question.
Okay, Mike, the question I received was, given the limitation of intercepting nuclear payloads and that the systems are made for all small rogue actors, what do you think will happen when the other states other than Russia proliferate past the point of our defense systems?
Another excellent question. We would at that time have to make a determination. I think that the thought process within the United States is that any rogue nation that developed a weapons program so robust that it could counter the missile defenses that we had would just fall into the category of Russia and China. That at that point we would just say, okay, their government, if they were able to get this many weapons over this amount of time, they're clearly a relatively stable regime that has some type of longevity. So we're just going to count them as deterred via the mutually assured destruction framework. Because like I said, the ability to lob nuclear weapons across oceans is relatively expensive. Not super complex, but extremely expensive. So a lot of nations, we don't foresee investing in that type of capability at a scale that we would necessarily be concerned about the either the current missile defense system that we have or the anticipated growth that we already have slated and approved.
Thank you. Okay, John, let's move to you.
Good afternoon, sir, professors in class. I have a question from one of my classmates here that I'll present, and it's regarding China's capabilities. The question reads, do you believe that as China seeks to gain global prominence and military supremacy within their corner of the world, that they will seek nuclear capabilities or arsenals on par with the US or Russia? And I suppose I'll edit the question slightly to say, if you don't think they'll be going for those arsenals, do you see the move going elsewhere to other forms of weaponry or traditional military capabilities?
No, good question. I think that China has really looked at its economic levers to achieve a lot of what it wants to do in the Pacific. It's clearly using its information capabilities, its cyber capabilities, and its economic prowess through predatory lending practices and a few other things to increase its influence around the region. I don't think that it necessarily sees nukes as required for that. I think the Chinese are relatively confident that the nuclear weapons they have currently are enough of a deterrent that we would not want to have in exchange. Well, yes, we do have, 7,000 weapons. They have, several hundred. The United States is probably not willing to write off several hundred cities within the United States in a conflict over China that escalated to nuclear. I can definitely see the Chinese developing over time potentially a slightly larger arsenal. But as they look at what Russia has and they see the economic albatross that is sitting both on Russia and on the United States based on the sheer size of our stockpile, that they probably won't want to buy that bill of goods. That they'll probably say, hey, what we have or maybe a slightly larger inventory is going to be sufficient for what we want, which is basically to deter the United States from invading China. And they will look at any other proxy war within their region really as something that they can keep at the conventional side and use their nuclear weapons to prevent us from escalating either on the high end of the conventional side or certainly to nuclear to counter their ability to have influence.
Okay, thank you. These are some good questions. Alex, we're going back to you.
How does the United States dispose of dangerous materials from the dismantling of nuclear weapons? Can we afford to make more weapons that would generate this waste that is expensive and difficult to get rid of?
Sure. So a lot of the nuclear material that is taken out of warheads is either immediately recast into other pits, which is the internal components of warheads, or it's poured into a stockpile that's just stored. There is some excess that normally will just basically, it's a terrible metaphor, but essentially be cut down like you would cut cocaine into a less enriched form and then is sold off to power plants for nuclear fuels. So that's where a lot of that material goes. So we have far more waste coming out of our nuclear power plants than anything. Our weapon system program is just infinitesimal compared to the amount of stuff that is coming out of our nuclear weapons plants. And that's one of the things that we may have to really take an honest look at. The reason that we do not reprocess our nuclear waste in the United States is because of treaty obligations that we had to eliminate or greatly reduce the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But a large part of that waste can actually be reprocessed to decrease the cubic amount of nuclear waste that we have, and then repurpose that recycled waste into items that we can actually use, such as fuel for nuclear power plants or other things. So I do think that as a nation, we have to take a hard look at, okay, I understand the purpose of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There were some unintended consequences that I think we have now had several decades to realize, like, oh, we didn't realize that this was how it's going to be turned out. And it might be time to go back and say, okay, let's look at a new treaty system with a lot of controls that will allow nuclear producing nations to reprocess these materials to limit the amount of nuclear waste we have. Because nuclear waste, absolutely, it's a problem. Just look at the discussion we have about Yucca Mountain, in regards to where are we going to store this long term when it's, a lot of these materials have half-lives that are measured in the hundreds of thousands of years, and where are you going to find a place that's geologically stable enough to store those? How are you going to have safety programs to keep them there safely, not only from a security aspect, but also from a groundwater aspect and other things? So it's a problem. I don't think that it's necessarily a problem on the nuclear weapon side, just because it's such an extremely small percentage, because all that nuclear material is exceptionally expensive. And the military, while we have a great reputation for spending a ton of your money, we do like to, try to be efficient where we can. So we don't just take it out of the nuke and throw it in the trash bin. Anything that can be reused is often reused. And that's one of our problems right now, is that we have reused so many elements of a lot of our nuclear weapons platforms for so long that a lot of the industries that produced all those platforms went bankrupt and went out of business. And now we're having a major problem reestablishing the industrial infrastructure to go after new nuclear weapons platforms or even to maintain or upgrade the weapon systems we have. We're a victim of our own success in many ways. I hope that answered it. And if I didn't answer it to their satisfaction, tell them to hit me again. I'll do it again.
Okay, Esnam, you're up.
Thank you, Professor. The next question that I received was from a student named Amber. Just a little background. Her father was responsible for standing up the U.S. Cybercom mission. So she wanted to ask that, do you think that U.S. Cybercom's offensive capabilities assist in nuclear deterrence or decreases deterrent power? So to elaborate, does their amount of power actually make the other states more likely to proliferate?
I do think that our offensive capabilities are robust and or growing. I do not necessarily think that our cyber capabilities increase the likelihood of a nuclear proliferation because countries, you know, like I said, countries don't want to launch nukes at the United States because we'll know who did it, essentially. Even if you smuggle it into the United States, we have sufficient nuclear forensics capability that I can tell you what reactor that material came out of, you know, so there's a traceability. So there's a heavy negative incentive to nations that have possession of nuclear material to prevent that from going into terrorist hands. I do think that our offensive capabilities, especially given some of the tools that have been leaked and some of our capabilities that have been leaked, if you are a nation that is not actively researching and trying to develop your own cyber capabilities against the United States or against your adversaries, you're probably very, very foolish, or you have no enemies. You're essentially Tahiti, where you're like, yeah, everybody loves us. We're Tahiti. You know, it's a gorgeous area. But any nation that has adversaries at this moment is already developing those cyber capabilities. And I do worry that non-state actors, based on just the exceptionally poor security that we have within the United States in regards to some of our infrastructure, because there's been a lot of resistance to have, you know, Cybercom's got a lot of capability, but Cybercom's capability is no good if you can't convince the, you know, private corporations that run a lot of our infrastructure to allow Cybercom to help them, you know, and there's a lot of resistance because there's a lot of strings that come attached to that. So yes, short answer is I'm not worried about our cyber capabilities forcing other nations to develop nuclear weapons. I am very convinced that our offensive capabilities have absolutely driven other nations to develop their own and try to catch us rapidly.
Great. I love that you just brought up the public-private conundrum in terms of utilities and all of this. That's a big issue. We will be getting to that in POLI 395. So that was a foreshadowing of something we're going to talk about. Okay, John, you're up.
I have a question here from Midshipman Berman from the POLI 395 class. She's in the Naval RTC unit, second class Berman. She asks if a conflict between smaller nuclear powers such as Pakistan and India were to rise, how would the U.S. stay neutral? At what point of destruction would this conflict affect other countries in the region?
No, it's a fabulous question. And that would really come down into the political leadership and also the, honestly, at that point, it would probably be the desires of the American public. You see the American public and how we react to natural disasters around the world, where there's an instant demand that, hey, the United States has to do something. So the next thing you know, we're sending the hospital ship Comfort, or, you know, some of the other Navy, it's usually the Navy, actually, because they have the capability to go out of their stuff there quickly. An exchange between India and Pakistan is going to go bad. It's going to go bad very, very quickly. The strategic interest for the United States is going to be to end that conflict as rapidly as possible by exceptionally heavy diplomacy. But the problem with that is if you have nations that have just nuked each other's capitals, the arguments made by our State Department or by our president to try to get them to stop that conflict are going to probably fall on deaf ears or dead ears in many cases. So it's really going to be, what are we going to do to manage the aftermath? It would depend on the type of weapons that were exchanged, especially on the burst height, whether they were doing mainly air burst or ground bursts, because that's going to define how heavily neighbors are affected by the fallout. I will tell you that I'm sure Bangladesh is probably going to have a bad day. And Bangladesh most days, because their economic situation has bad days, so they'd be least able to handle it. And I would absolutely think that if it got to a certain level, China would probably want to become involved because a lot of that fallout is going to be heading toward China. So it would get very, very exciting. It's one of the reasons that I worry most. When I think about nukes, Pakistan and India is where I worry the most. Iran is manageable. It'd be problematic if they got a weapon, but it would be manageable. If there is a nuclear flashpoint in the world right now, in my opinion, it is not North Korea. It is India and Pakistan.
Okay, you're in Dr. Haggerty's wheelhouse. That's what he does, and I think that's what keeps him up at night too, if I'm not mistaken. Viviana, we're back to you.
All right, continuing on this India and Pakistan trend. Why is the danger between India and Pakistan so great when both nations have nuclear arms, and for that reason there's nuclear deterrence? Wouldn't this prevent nuclear warfare because it would be much worse if only one nation had nuclear powers versus the other?
No, it's an excellent question. It would be more dangerous in a normal situation if only one state had a nuclear weapon and other states did not. Now, the increased threat really then becomes conventional weapons, the conventional war. The United States have tons of nuclear weapons. We've only technically fought one nuclear war, and we were the only, side that used nuclear weapons during that war to end it. The concern about India and Pakistan, like I said before, is they are relatively new to the nuclear stage. They are at an economic and infrastructure level that is not similar to what the United States had when it was developing its nuclear weapons program. You have to remember when the United States developed nuclear weapons, it was really bombs for 15 years essentially, and it was planes. It was very dramatic. Took you a long time to get where you got to go. There was a lot of conscious steps that had to happen. Right now, and we had the benefit of being geographically separated from the enemy that had nuclear weapons. So you were never worried about that a Soviet attack across the Canadian border with tanks would ultimately escalate to a nuclear exchange because the Soviets weren't worried about that. You had a little bit of worry in Western Europe. With India and Pakistan, because they have an extremely poor relationship with each other right now, and like I said before in the briefing, the security protocols on some of their weapon systems and the physical engineering safety of some of their warheads raise concerns that an accidental detonation of a weapon would cause an immediate response by both sides because no one would be sure who shot what. They just know something blew up, so there's going to be a response. The other issue you get into is what we call a dead man switch. There have been indications that some of the nations have basically, instead of a positive action, as in the event of an attack, wait on the word from the president to launch your weapons, which is what we have in the United States. We have what's called a positive feedback loop. In some cases, there's indication that there's a negative feedback loop in one of those two nations, where the launch of a large-scale war, if you are not able to make contact with your national command authority, that means you are allowed to use weapons of your own accord. And that is a concern when you have countries whose communications networks are not as fully developed or fully protected as the ones that you find in, like, let's say, Russia, China, or the United States. So there's a lot of concern that the rules of deterrence, while they do apply slightly, there is a much more increased risk of inadvertently scaling that escalation ladder without meaning to.
Okay, before I go back to Alex, I'm going to jump in here with a question that I see from a student, Aiden, and he says, what lessons were learned during the Ebola outbreak that were applied to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Oh, that's a great question. Lessons that were learned, or at least attempted to be learned, was if you can stop it early, you're better off. That's why there was a clear attempt in New York when it first came in the United States and in Washington State, those first critical weeks There was a lot of effort by healthcare workers, not so much by the governments, unfortunately, in my opinion. But the healthcare workers are really understanding that, the Dr. Fauci folks, they clearly understood that if we can nip this in the bud right now, that we have a chance. Once it broke out beyond those barriers, then you were just kind of in management mode. There was no longer a belief that you could stop the outbreak. Now it was just, we will keep the numbers low enough so that the hospitals are not overwhelmed. The difficulty that we have in applying lessons of Ebola to COVID is Ebola is a relatively simple disease when it comes down to it. It's much more lethal. You're running your lethality of 85% or higher if you're infected without treatment. And even with treatment, unless you get it early enough, you're still sitting about, 70%. But it's much harder to catch. There is no airborne Ebola. There is nothing like that. Like, I worked with Ebola folks. I'm still here, didn't die or anything. It's much more difficult to pass between people, so it's much more manageable. COVID, once we determined that it was capable of not necessarily being airborne, it's more aerosolized, which is a distinction to when you're in the bioweapons game like I am. But basically, instead of it floating around and staying somewhere in the air for hours, really that 6-foot distance, because it's droplets that fall to the floor. That is a much harder nut to crack. And we saw that in the United States. Now, do I think that we definitely could have taken some different actions that I think would have been far more effective early on? I absolutely do. I differed quite a bit with the leadership at that time, but I'm a military officer, so I can't talk about, disagreements necessarily that I had with National Command Authority, even after they leave office. But I will tell you that based on my experience with Ebola, I would have handled things differently. But now that we have it, like I said, now it's all about getting vaccines into arms. Full supporter. I'm waiting around for my vaccine. Unfortunately, being in a student status, I won't get it as early as some of the other my peers that are on nuclear submarines and nuclear missile silos. I agree they should have that first because they're the ones with little brass keys. And I'm just sitting up on the student. And in the Army, colonels are a dime a dozen. I could die tomorrow and they'll replace me easily. I am much more concerned about my wife right now, who is a teacher and is substitute teaching up here. If I had one vaccine to give in the house, she would get it long before I would, because she's at much higher risk. I'm able to take other steps at work to avoid that. I will say that if you have the opportunity to get the vaccine, go get it, please. And if you don't want to take it and they've got it available, call me. I'll come get it.
Well, I hope your wife gets it very soon. I haven't read much about how Pennsylvania is doing on that front, but Maryland's been able to right the ship a little over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, now, unfortunately, Pennsylvania's response gets filed under the official Army terminology of dumpster fire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, well, we'll keep the fingers crossed on that front. Okay, so it's almost 5:45. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Alex, take it away.
You mentioned in your presentation that there was a threat from non-state actors gaining access to radioactive materials and using them in a fashion such as destroying the city. In your opinion, should the U.S. shift its focus from nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence towards a focus on preventing radioactive materials from getting into the hands of non-state actors?
Yeah, no, great question. I will tell you that we do a lot on that. A lot of it is on the dark side, so you never hear about it. But trust me, there's a lot of stuff going on that. There's unclassified things as well. Like, you'll see police officers that are walking around with what looks like old school pagers on their belts. Those are not pagers. Those are radiacs that will vibrate or will beep when they're in the vicinity. So if they're just in a traffic stop and it starts buzzing, guess what? Someone's getting yanked out of a car. So those type of activities are occurring. I will tell you, if you never want to sleep again, the Department of Energy does have a website that's called the Lost Nuclear Materials page, and it's updated every single day with the items that are radioactive or related to the nuclear industry that have gone missing or where there has been an accident. It's updated daily. I unfortunately was shown this website when I was at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. I watched it for about 3 weeks and I was like, okay, I'm never looking at that webpage again, because every single day it's like, oh, we lost this now. Oh, we lost this now. Usually out of industrial applications, a lot of well density gauges and things like that. But we do have some security problems, especially in medical facilities. So I'm not worried about somebody breaking into a nuclear power plant and taking anything. I am much more concerned about the sheer number of materials that we have in medical facilities, especially those that are involved in radiotherapy, because those items are usually highly radioactive and relatively easy to take apart and take with you. So we do have some steps that we need to take on that. Unfortunately, that really comes into outside the military lane. If it's inside the United States, we do provide some technology to the civilian populace that we have developed for use in other parts of the world. But you get into a kind of a touchy situation when you start using U.S. military assets within the United States for a host of federal law reasons, not just posse comitatus.
Hello. The next question I received was from a student called Jason Ward, and he asked, do you think that conscription in the United States would help fix some of the issues that you cited earlier in the course in relation to hyperpartisanship and military relationship with the civilian population? In elaboration, does conscription in other countries such as Israel work in fixing these issues?
That is a phenomenal question. I will tell you, I do believe that a year of service of some type, where a individual, let's say a gap year in between high school and college, or maybe junior year of high school. I'll tell you personally, I don't think I got a lot out of my junior year of high school. I'm sure my junior teachers will tell you otherwise. But a AmeriCorps type equivalent. I don't know if the military. The big problem we have right now with the military is the health readiness of the American population has dwindled to a point that most people that show up to try to join the military can't. They show up and for health reasons, either because they have certain underlying health conditions, or they have taken certain type of drugs in relations to mental health treatment, or a few other things, they're disqualified from service. So we are turning away actively people that want to join. I do absolutely believe that a compulsory service for every American, let's say coming out of high school, because it's really high school age is where you can affect the mental processes and really help people develop. If you have, somebody like me who's 44 and you're like, oh, you're going to go do a mandatory year. Like, I'm set in my ways. I'm an old man. Like, I'm grouchy and I throw things at kids in the street and, things like that. But getting those folks that are your age, that are the future, and having them spend time together outside of their comfort bubbles, outside of the people that were in their neighborhood, outside of the people that, they went to school with. That's the great thing about the Army. I joined the Army. I came out, as I was a, son of an Army officer, but one of the guys was an inner city kid that had just gotten a scholarship to go to college. I had a farmer. I had folks that, parents that were rich, parents that were poor, every possible ethnic group I could possibly think of. And they were all in my 40-person platoon. And we learned through, what we like to call in the military shared suffering. The Army tells you it builds character, where, they basically punish you physically and it draws you together as a team. And I'll tell you, we did not have a lot of racism issues in that platoon, because everybody was a soldier just like everybody else. And the people that were kind of cast out of the platoon, it wasn't based on a race, it was based on who was willing to work and who was willing to volunteer and who was willing to do their job and do it well. It didn't matter where you came from. Nobody cared. Nobody knew, I didn't know that my best friend there, grown up in the inner city, and he and I are still friends 20 years later. And I had no clue, except for the fact that I had to teach him how to swim because he'd never had access to a pool. And the Army's kind of big on being able to swim. So I spent my evenings teaching him to swim for 3 weeks. But yes, compulsory service is a good idea. Compulsory military service, not as much, not because it's a bad thing, just because it would place a burden on the military based on the health status of a lot of the people that would be brought in. But I think there is a ton to do to improve our nation. You can have folks out cleaning up, distressed neighborhoods, painting houses, clearing garbage off freeways, mentoring, younger kids, helping teach things. There's a ton of activities that people can get involved in, building homes for the homeless. There's a ton of stuff that you can do that's good manual labor that doesn't require a ton of skills, or they can teach you a skill while you do it. But more importantly, will teach you to talk to people that don't look like you. And that's really what this nation needs.
Do you have one more question you'd like to pose?
I do have one more question I'd like to ask. This one's coming from another one of my classmates. It's if the nuclear launch authority systems are unhackable, is there a reason why we should upgrade them? Why should we put ourselves at risk and upgrade our launch authorities if they're working properly?
No, it's a great question. The main reason is that the systems on which the nuclear control systems are on are so old that a lot of those companies have gone out of business, and we can't physically replace the stuff that just breaks over time. I mean, after so many years, you know, circuit boards go bad, other things break, and a lot of that knowledge on how to manufacture all those materials, you know, the civilian world has gone away from it because it's archaic, you know, that infrastructure. So you can't go to Microsoft and say, hey, we need you to upgrade this system. Microsoft looks like we don't even have programmers that do that. The last programmer that, you know, knew how to program that specific language died in the 1980s, and nobody else has learned it because they've moved on to multiple other languages or multiple types of circuit boards or circuit encoding. That's the main reason for the upgrade, is that we can't do a one-for-one exchange because that industrial infrastructure no longer exists in the United States, and it would be virtually impossible to recreate it. But I agree, it's frustrating. I like the fact it's run by an Apple IIc and you can't hack it. I sleep well at night knowing that, you know, nukes are not going to magically go Skynet on me.
Okay, another good question. I'm going to suggest the following. I know that Dr. Cynthia Hody was able to join us. She could not get in initially because of a password gone awry or some such thing, but she was able to join us. I would love to give her the opportunity to ask you something about your career or even your time at UMBC. Before we do that, my POLI 395 students are going to be, are all going to go, but I want you guys to jump into our regular WebEx site after we're done here just for a few minutes so I can give you some instruction, since this is the last class before spring break for us, Colonel Waite.
That's just mean. The Army does not believe in spring break, and they should.
So let's turn out, before I go to Dr. Hody, let me just say that this has been just fantastic. Thank you so much. The Q&A, the lecture, the Q&A, your comments about everything that you've done in your career, just fabulous. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and to talk to all of us here at UMBC. It's been great. POLI 395, I will see you at 6 in our usual location. All right, and let me turn it over to Dr. Hody here.
I just thank you so much for the opportunity. It was fantastic being able to talk to everybody. I love seeing all these smart, bright faces out there getting ready to do great things for the U.S.
Well, Bradley, it's wonderful to see you after so many years, and pardon me for the informality, but that's
how have you not aged? I'm like 20 years older and broke down with bad knees. You still look fantastic. This is baloney.
You are very, very kind, and I appreciate those words. It heartens me when you were calling yourself at 44 old. It sort of gave me pause, and so.
See, but I much like dog years, I have Army years. You know, it wears you down, you know, 7 times as fast.
It was absolutely wonderful to hear you, your remarks. I was heartened by just how thoughtful your observations were, particularly about the role of the military in global politics today, and that necessary and important balance between private, public, and military. And I also appreciated your nod to the importance of economic issues, as you know, certainly pertains to U.S.-China relations. So, you know, you obviously learned something at UMBC and have taken it to a great extent, and so it's really delightful to appreciate how far you've come along.
Yeah, I'd like to note for all the other students, she said she was pleasantly surprised that I turned out okay, essentially, because I was probably a terrible student that she remembers.
No, actually, I remember you quite fondly, and always thought you had some really interesting things to contribute. Had a very different, unique, and important point of view even back then. And I also liked that even though you were ROTC, you were committed to a military career, you understood all along that, you know, that wasn't the be all and end all. It was a tool. The military is a tool. It has a role, and you kept it in perspective.
Right now, and that's one of the biggest concerns, not just myself, but everyone in my small group and really across the military, is that we feel that yes, the military is a tool. It is supposed to be the tool of last resort, and unfortunately, we have for lack of a better term, seemed to become the easy button for the nation. Every time there's a big problem, oh, let's throw the military at it, and they'll sort it out. And we have let some of our other capabilities atrophy over the last decades. It would probably be far more useful, especially globally, but also here at home, in solving those problems. And the military could pretty much say, hey, look, they're better at it than us. We'll go in and we'll fix it. It'll be very ugly, but we'll make it happen because we're the military, and we'll fight our way through it. But I'd much rather have some situations that get cleaned up clearly by the right people, as opposed to, there's a reason they say if you're a hammer, every problem in the world looks like a nail. And we are an exceptional hammer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I missed the beginning of your, introductory remarks as I was fumbling around trying to get myself, access into the meeting. What are you? I hear you're going to ultimately, settle in Seattle. What's your time frame? You will finish your degree at War College when, and what comes next for you?
Right. So I'm wrapping up my education here at the War College in June of this year. So I'll have my second master's, and there are a lot of people who thought I'd never even make it out of high school. I'll have my second master's, and then I will move on to the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I will actually run what is called their Foreign Munitions Program. So I will be the guy that flies around the world picking up random weapon systems from countries that probably don't want us to have them, and bringing them back to the United States so that a bunch of 30-pound brains can take them apart in the lab and tell us how they work, and more importantly, how to keep ourselves safe from them. So that's my next job. I'll probably do that for about 2 years in DC, and then I may get the opportunity to be a commander again, and I'll end up being an EOD group commander. So I'll run EOD for half the United States. And at some point, about 9 years, 7 months, 3 days, who's counting, I will move on and I will retire. And hopefully my investments that I've made over the years and my pension will be enough for me to sit out on the back deck and read all of the textbooks that you assigned me back in my undergrad that I never got around to reading.
You don't have to fess up to that. But wonderful to see you, and please don't hesitate to drop me a line. Wonderful to keep up with your activities.
I should point out we've already promised to drag him up to campus when he's going to be in DC next year, and when campus is a little bit more user-friendly for all of us. So
yes.
You'll be amazed, actually, based on some of the things you said, you'll be amazed at the number of veterans we have in our student body today. It's really
that's outstanding. No, that's great news. It's always good. Like I said, it brings a little bit different perspective to the university. There's one regret that I have is that I joined the Army after going to college. I think the study habits that they taught me at EOD school, where they teach you nuclear physics in 7 days by any means possible, would have really helped me in my study habits in my undergrad. I have definitely done far better in my 2 master's degrees academically than I did in my undergrad. And I'll send a note to Professor Starkey that'll have my updated email address, because the email address that she has on file is actually only while I'm here at the university, because it's just like everything in the military. If you're in an academic institution, they give you new stuff. But I'll give her the one that will actually work for the rest of my career. So once I'm down in DC, you guys can grab me.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for agreeing to come and speak. I know it was a mutually advantageous arrangement.
No, it was. I'll get to graduate the War College now. I'm super appreciative. But no, it was fabulous. And my hats off to the students in true retriever fashion. Their questions were very pointed and very poignant. And I didn't get anything I wasn't expecting, but well thought out and great questions. So I wish them the absolute best wherever their academic career and future civilian careers take them.
I think we had one more question from S&M. Do you want to go ahead?
I have time.
Yes, sorry. I meant
No problem whatsoever. I'm here for you guys.
Thank you. Okay, so my question was actually, I was surprised to hear you just say that you joined the military after college. That's one thing that I've kind of been struggling with right now. And I wanted to ask, was that a hindrance to you joining after you got your education? Did that limit you in any way?
No. It didn't limit me in any way. To become an officer, the time that I joined, you had to go through either West Point, Officer Candidate School, or through ROTC. So the ROTC program that you go through in college, like you wear a uniform, but you're not in the military, So you graduate college, you're commissioned as an officer, and then you report for duty at your first duty station. In my case, Fort Benning, Georgia, because the Army loves anything. We love hot places. So went down to Georgia for my first duty station. But I will tell you, anytime that you want to join, the Army's pretty much hiring, or the Navy, or the Air Force, or the Marines, not really the Air Force, stay away from those guys. But there's great opportunities, and I will tell you that I can look back right now at a 21-year career, and I got 9 years going forward, and I don't look at it as it's a slog fest, I've got 9 more years to go. I really look at it as like, man, in 9 years, I'm going to really miss all the folks that I've worked with. I have met just phenomenal soldiers. Every single day that I was in command, I had young 18-year-olds that worked for me. And it's like watching your kids grow up, over the course of a 2 to 3 year command, watching how they mature, watching how they take on leadership positions and stuff. It's like having 400 kids, but on an accelerated growth scale. And just, it makes you so proud to see all the great things that they can accomplish. And these are folks that, joined up. Some of them joined up said, hey, I'm going to do 4 years so I can get some college money. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. And some folks joined up for that reason and then decided to stay. And we were always happy to have them stay. But could not be more proud of the folks that, raised the right hand and said, hey, look, I joined. But there's a ton of other people that I idealize too. My wife's a teacher. I have a deep respect for teachers. You guys aren't paid enough, and you work way too many hours. So you can be successful in anything you want to be as long as you're willing to work hard at it and realize that you can get knocked down pretty hard. The question is whether or not you're going to get back up. And there's been several times in my career where I've been knocked down hard and had to get back up, a couple of times by explosions that were rather unpleasant. But you stand back up and you dust yourself off and you get back on mission. And that's what I tell everybody every day. And I had a lot of soldiers that, the first time they ever took that hard hit was in the Army. They actually had something bad happen to them. Death of a family member, death of a friend, or and that's a struggle. And that's something we have to do to prepare our youth for, is that there's going to be bad days. And once they realize it, they always persevere and they always do great things.
Thank you so much. Really, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, if you want to join up, you just let me know. Send a note through your professor. I'll link you up to a recruiter. I've got no problem.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Colonel. It's been great having you. Good luck with the rest of your stay there in Carlisle, and we look forward to seeing you after you make that. What is it? You're going to be your 32nd move down to DC from Carlisle?
It'll be 30, 32. I'm going to have to recount because I think I may be up around 34. I think I may have missed some.
See you somewhere along the way.
Yeah, at some point, all the homes blur together. My wife laughs because this is only her second move in the Army. And she's like, well, don't you remember your address from that? I was like, oh, that was like 13 moves ago. No, I do not remember my address. I don't even remember where I was 13 years ago. I have to go back on the list and figure out where in the world I was.
That's great.
Well, it's wonderful to see you. Stay in touch, Bradley, and look forward to a meeting on campus.
I look very much forward to it. I want to see how it's all grown. I'm sure Freeman has done just phenomenal things.
He has. So I'll sign out now and hopefully talk to you in the not too distant future.
Well, everyone have a great evening. And once again, thanks for the opportunity.